Thank you very much indeed, Glenn, for that kind and generous introduction. It's excellent to see so many familiar faces here tonight. In case I forget later on, as I'm prone to do, thank you very much for coming. And it's also wonderful, of course, to see many new faces as well. So each year, at the end of the academic session, lecturers generally receive feedback forms from their students who have taken their courses. This last year, I was particularly struck by one form. The student gave scores for my module, Transport Policy and Finance, that indicated that he had found it interesting and useful. But in the comment box wrote a phrase that indicated that he had found my outlook on the future excessively pessimistic. This brought me up with a start. Most lecturers would want to be objective, but unlike in other walks of life, where to be optimistic is a virtue, in academic circles, the social and professional risks of being shown to be overly optimistic are generally greater than being excessively pessimistic. Being optimistic could suggest naivety, or worse, complicity with the state or big business. So perhaps I had erred too far on the side of caution in trying to represent complex problems realistically. So in my lecture this evening, I would like to provide an appraisal of the transport problems which affect our daily lives and threaten our environment and well-being, an appraisal that acknowledges the full seriousness of those issues, whilst at the same time accepts that the future is uncertain and no doubt offers opportunity as well as threat. In doing so, I would like to make a point of responding to my student feedback, or should I say, in the spirit of the new academia, knowledge transfer client. In looking for opportunities, during this lecture I will reflect on positive developments that I've observed in the first 20 years of my career. It was a bit of a shock writing this, realising that perhaps I'm about halfway through now. So my lecture will be in 4 parts. By way of introduction, I'll begin with a brief review of some of the key unresolved policy debates of the last 2 decades. I'll then turn to consider the extent to which new electric car technologies offer a novel solution to these issues. The third section will reflect on whether conventional bus systems will be sufficient to support radical change in the UK. And lastly, I'll examine the emergence of collective mobility solutions and how they have the potential to allow rapid behavioural adjustment, avoiding socioeconomic strife. I entered transport studies in 1991, attracted to this field precisely because of the public debates around sustainability of our transport choices. Transport policy in practice was being widely questioned for the first time since the oil shocks and motorway expansion protests of the 1970s. Within a few years, events such as the London smog of December 1991 and high-profile road development protests had a major effect on public opinion. Support for roads-oriented transport policy fell with rising recognition that transport-derived poor air quality was one of the largest causes of premature death in the UK. Within the built environment professions, awareness grew that decisions made in spatial planning could have a major impact on the need to travel by car. Subsequently, a Royal Commission report in 1991 convinced government to make road travel more expensive, and in 1997 the Road Traffic Reduction Act was passed, arguably a high point in the rhetoric of car restraint policy. And following the return of a Labour government in 1997, the practical prospects for reducing the need to travel by car and lorry initially appeared to be strong, through a new white paper which emphasised integration and better management of roads rather than new construction. The 2000s, though, began with public protests again, this time about what was then seen as a sudden and large increase in fuel prices. As this chart shows, more recent increases have in fact pushed the price of road fuel higher in real terms. But at the time, there was a particular zeitgeist around the high cost of fuel. The public response unsettled government and pushed any policy tools likely to have had a serious effect on travel choices, such as a national scheme for road user charging, beyond effective policy reach. Instead, a 10-year investment plan sought to increase capacity and reduce journey times for all of the highly mechanised transport modes, road and rail. Walking and cycling had a variable experience in this time. Network development strategies became a necessary component of local authority transport plans, but the two modes together only received a total 3 pages in the 2004 White Paper. By the end of the decade, however, government had embarked on the flagship Sustainable Travel Towns and Cycling Demonstration Towns programmes. These sought to establish whether greater public investment over multiple years did actually make a worthwhile difference to how people travelled. The results have generally been encouraging. For example, the interim results for the cycling demonstration towns showed a 27% increase in cycling levels. But these outcomes have been hard-won, emphasising the scale of the challenge. May 2010 brought the coalition government to power and marked a strange period in transport policy. It began with the delivery of some manifesto promises, notably 2 associated with Heathrow Airport. The announcement that the provision of new runway capacity at Heathrow and Stansted was no longer national policy was, I believe, the right decision. From a technical point of view, the justification of the need for the new runways was deterministically linked to demand forecasts that made assumptions about economic growth and fuel prices that now look optimistic. And from a policy perspective, it was simply illogical to have committed the country to very significant carbon reduction targets whilst promoting an industry which currently has no clear options for significantly reducing its climate change impacts. The other announcement, more at the micro scale, concerned the infamous M4 bus lane. U-turns are not normally allowed on motorways, but in this case the bus lane will be removed, except for a few weeks in 2012 when it will make a reappearance for some important sporting fixtures. But at the same time, there are rumours that it might actually make a more permanent return. But beyond these specifics, the overall transport strategy that has emerged, in fact, shows considerable continuity with the 2000s. The coalition's policy to invest £37 billion, perhaps eventually a lot more, in a high-speed rail spine recalls Labour's £180 billion 10-year plan, much of it not in fact delivered, although the high-speed line to the Channel Tunnel and the West Coast Main Line upgrade were completed in that period. Regarding the road network, the coalition proposes managing the road network better, as did Labour. For example, extending the application of hard shoulder running and perhaps raising the motorway speed limit to 80 miles per hour in a rather unusual piece of voluntary harmonisation with the European norm. Policy on motoring costs remains nervous and unchanged. Flirtations with a fuel duty stabiliser ended with the advice it was unworkable. Cycling remains popular in rhetorical terms, with plenty of keen cyclists to be found in and around Westminster. But effective policy delivery remains piecemeal and partial. At this point, though, I want to be sure to inject some optimism, or for those versed in transport appraisal, perhaps we could call it pessimism bias. What has improved since 1991? Well, the appropriateness of road construction as a transport solution is much more widely questioned, and on occasion projects have been turned down on environmental grounds. Some of the worst features of company car taxation have been reformed, removing the incentive for company car users to achieve more miles per year in order to pay less personal tax. The annual road tax system now incentivises consumers to buy more efficient cars. And despite a very rocky road, and of course with a lot of assistance from the world oil market, car fuel prices are now beginning to send a signal that fossil fuel resources are scarce. For various reasons, there is tentative evidence now that the growth in road traffic in the industrialised states is coming to an end, as shown by the trends in passenger car traffic on this chart for both the OECD and the EU. Nonetheless, in 2011, we find ourselves trapped in much the same impasse as 1997. There is genuine concern that our transport choices are making a much bigger contribution to an evolving environmental disaster. And as Giddens has argued, since the dangers posed by global warming aren't tangible, immediate or visible, in the course of day-to-day life, however awesome they appear, many will sit on their hands and do nothing of a concrete nature about them. Yet waiting until they become visible and acute before being stirred to serious action will, by definition, be too late. In other words, there is not yet sufficient alarm to overcome the fear that significant change would undermine economic growth, generally still seen to be essential, as well as making life personally less convenient for individuals required to alter their travel behaviour. And from a politician's perspective, economic pain and elector discomfort remains a toxic mix for non-electability. Due to this vacuum in effective policy, it is possible to identify two popular policy ideas which appear to offer us a direction, but which I believe do not stand up to serious analysis. I should emphasise that these ideas are not my views, but they're my characterisation of what I believe are two widely held views. The first runs like this. It would be good if people use their cars a bit less, but there is nothing wrong with individual car ownership in itself. Car clubs are fine for a minority. Most people derive a pleasure from car ownership over and above fulfilling basic travel needs. Anyway, our economic prosperity relies on the UK market of around 2 million new cars being sold per annum. And the second runs like this. The real problems with private car use are the accidents and environmental pollution caused. And if we could just hang on a few more years, then the scientists and engineers will have those problems solved and we can go back to business as usual. There is, of course, plenty of evidence which contrasts or questions this focus on technical solutions. There is the fact that nearly a quarter of households don't have access to a car at all. Well, even within households with cars, many members of the household may not have complete access all the time. The number of households without access to a car can also be expected to rise with the ageing population and with the rising cost of car insurance for younger adults. The second problem is that improvements in air pollution also now seem to have peaked and potentially are going to reverse. There are also rival views about the importance of streets as living spaces as well as movement corridors. Indeed, there have been recent successes in the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones, already routine abroad. But central to future policy is the dream of the electric car, or sometimes it's the hydrogen car or the fuel cell car. The attraction is understandable. Assuming we can generate all the power necessary from renewable sources, the scientists manage to fix the vehicle range issue, and sufficient rare metals exist for the various batteries and catalysts to make mass adoption possible, we are offered a vision of low-cost, carbon-free, nearly silent motoring. Well, the latter point won't, of course, be welcomed by all, particularly those for whom the whole point of owning a car is to turn heads. Perhaps all visions, though, need a certain level of plausibility to be effective. Electric cars now exist. Microcars can be bought for a few £1,000s. Hatchback-sized cars are also available, although for a substantial premium over the equivalent internal combustion engine cars. Therefore, it can't be denied that a policy solution relying solely on technological substitution is theoretically possible. What is at stake here is how far such a vision is plausible. In fact, a number of issues remain to be resolved, which together add up to a major question mark. The new battery electric and fuel cell technologies are reliant on precious metals such as palladium and platinum, which are not readily sourced within the Western democracies. How far do we want to replace dependence on oil and OPEC with reliance on rare minerals which are found only in a few places on the planet? How will we recharge electric cars in the thousands of Victorian-era streets where the actually achieved density of car parking is much higher than could be officially sanctioned due to pavement parking and other technically illegal practices? Will motorists be prepared to trade creature comforts such as power-hungry air conditioning for battery range? Or will they be reluctant to move beyond the much more limited environmental benefits brought by the hybrid cars, which offer more flexibility over range and choice of accessories? We have already seen how far electric supply can be vulnerable in times of peak demand, such as heat waves. How many electric cars the UK grid could serve would be dependent upon how many people wanted to charge at the same time and how dispersed they were across that grid. 3 million electric cars nationally, around 10% of the current fleet, might not cause major problems. But the same probably wouldn't be true if all of 3 million of those cars were in London at once. How quickly can and will our national power distribution infrastructure be upgraded? Supposing all these supply issues can be solved, though, and prices fall with economies of scale towards the cost of internal combustion engine cars, what would be the result? Given current levels of renewable energy production and likely rates of growth, the car fleet would remain fossil fuel dependent for its electricity for many years to come, and so far from carbon neutral. Unless a dual pricing and taxation system for automotive electricity consumption is introduced, electric car users will face very low transport costs and pay virtually no tax on their car use. The logical consequences of this would be an increase in traffic and congestion, and therefore political demands for more road capacity. At the same time, there will be a reduction in motoring taxes. Currently, motorists contribute around £40 billion to the exchequer each year, mainly in fuel duty. This sum contributes nearly 10% of all government tax revenues. In order to recover these revenues, government may seek to impose a separate regime, perhaps using unique plugs and meters, but the potential for fraud would be substantial and hard to detect. It would, of course, be far simpler at that point to introduce road user charging, and this in fact seems more likely. Exactly how and when road user charging is introduced would depend on the nature of the transition. Initially, there would only be a minority of electric car users, so government would face falling tax revenues, but it may find it politically difficult to impose a road pricing scheme on everyone. No doubt a tipping point will be reached, at which point road pricing would be introduced rapidly. But in the short run, the taxation problem may be a real barrier to transition. Indeed, a government with problematic tax revenues may need to slow pedal on the promotion of electric cars. So to conclude this part, if the electric car is to make a significant contribution to future mobility, there's going to need to be a massive investment in the national power infrastructure, widespread provision of recharging points, and complete reform of the motoring taxation system. Depending on which recharging system is adopted, and currently competition between them is another potential delaying factor, urban street management and planning controls will also need to be reformed. Car costs will need to fall, although whether this happens may be dependent on how far other industries are competing for the same raw materials. And if all this does happen, then noxious pollution would be removed from the streets to the locations of power generation. but we will still have an ongoing climate change emissions problem, and road congestion might get worse. Turning to the third part of my presentation concerning public transport, I will begin by observing another positive change since 1991. This is the recognition that transport policies work in packages, because what works for one traveller might not work for another. So providing options is important for building consensus. Also, packages can include both incentives for change and levers for change. Given scarce resources, though, we cannot invest in everything. Strategies need to have emphasis. In this context, most transport policy discussions tend to emphasise the bus as the most generally applicable tool for achieving modal shift to more space and carbon efficient transport. Walking and cycling are held to be important, but a number of social groups are seen to be less able to take advantage of these modes, variously the young, elderly, unfit, parents with young children, those unprepared to face inclement weather, or those who find the threat from traffic unacceptable. I'm certainly not indicating that I personally accept all of those views completely, but it is the case that modern low-floor buses are physically accessible to nearly all and can provide for longer journeys than most people are prepared to walk. However, considered in terms of transition theory, buses are part of a secondary regime rather than the dominant regime. What is meant by that distinction is that most groups in society associate their transport with the car in terms of norms and expectations. And as a consequence, our systems of production and consumption are also mostly organised around the car, and our built environment along with it in terms of what is easily and pleasantly accessible. There are, of course, particular niches in which public transport is important, niches in which it provides for a large share or the majority of journeys and socially is the done thing. These niches support the dominant regime and primarily arise from space and built environment constraints. For example, commuting into central London occurs mainly by public transport due to the limited supply of road space and car parking. Water buses are used in Venice and the Eurostar to visit Paris due to the absence of a continuous road network on which to operate cars. Bus park and ride can be popular for the final part of journeys into historic cities or for a few weeks in 2012 to access the Olympics. The key point here is that in these niches, the quantity and quality of public transport are a key focus of the powerful interests within the transport policy system, be they politicians, businesses, construction companies, transport operators, or wealthy middle-class voters. In general, though, public transport niches exist outside of the dominant car regime. These separate networks have generally survived as second-choice transport options for people without access to cars, either due to financial means or lack of driving skills or licences, or alternatively, because some people choose to live outside of the dominant car regime. The distinction between the niches of public transport is fundamental, and the point is often lost in generic appeals that we must improve public transport in order to get people out of their cars. Viewed from this perspective, the current national flagship public transport schemes are largely complementary to the private car regime. High-speed rail and London Crossrail will essentially link up city centres and airports. While some trips may be attractive from car, many will be trips that would have been made by rail in any case, or by air. And there will be little impact on the lower profile, frequent, routine trips of up to around 25 miles in length, which make up the bulk of our travel as a society and which are at the core of car-dependent lifestyles. This important chart clarifies that most car-based carbon emissions are in fact produced by medium-length trips, not the short ones replaceable by walking, nor the long ones replaceable by rail. The bus does have the potential to serve these medium-range journeys, but as a mode largely outside the dominant regime, it has to a large extent already captured the easy-to-reach market, customers who find the current offer sufficiently attractive compared with competitors at the price at which it is sold. In order to increase market share, we must either improve the offer in absolute terms or in some way reduce the relative attractiveness of competitor products, or indeed cut the price. Pessimism bias. To remind about some positive developments in respect of the bus offer. Ticketing technologies have developed significantly in the last 20 years, with online booking now possible. The Oyster multicard introduced in London, and smart cards are now promised in many other locations. Information provision is better. The vehicles are sometimes equipped with air conditioning and internet access. Many buses are now low emission and low floor. There are also experiments with new technologies, including this hybrid bus we are evaluating with First Bus and Bath and North East Somerset Council as part of the Renaissance project. And such changes to improve the offer do have an effect on bus use. The showcase bus improvements in the Bristol area have been worth 10 to 15% increases in bus trips on the specific routes treated, although only a proportion of those would have switched from car. High investment strategies are proposed for public transport solutions in segregated corridors such as bus rapid transit. BRT schemes are too new in the UK to be clear about the actual benefits, but it can be assumed that patronage increase would be somewhat greater. However, each BRT scheme will take many years to deliver because, like all major infrastructure schemes, they raise very real conflicts between interests within the planning system and have substantial financing and funding requirements. Improving the relative position of public transport, particularly buses, is much more challenging, as bus journey times are generally longer than car journey times. Most major UK cities are now moving towards a situation in which the relatively easy bus lane options have already been delivered, and further development runs into conflict with interests who see the street as an economic marketplace or a parking facility or a social amenity space, as well as a traffic corridor. Similarly, car journeys are generally perceived as cheaper than bus journeys, except where high parking charges or road tolls influence this calculation. But there seems little prospect at the current time that a government of any of the three largest political parties would be prepared to bring about a significant increase in motoring costs. Moreover, if they did, this would tend to affect only the minority of car journeys which are made to city centres at peak times. Price is mainly in the hands of the private sector bus companies in the UK outside London. Bus fares are often seen as too expensive, and experience with concessionary fares in recent years has shown that some car users can be attracted by completely free bus travel. But except for the 10% or so profit margin on the costs of providing bus services, it's hard to see how a different model of ownership and regulation will result in cheaper bus fares without increased state subsidy, whether or not the industry is in the public or private sector. And this is clear from comparing the parts of England with private sector services, the ones in the English metropolitan areas and the non-metropolitan areas, with those franchised by Transport for London, where the subsidy for tendered services is considerably higher. The question about the appropriate model of bus ownership and regulation is a large one, and I'm not seeking to resolve it today. My point is simply that the main influence on fare levels is the extent to which the state wishes to intervene with subsidy, regardless of who owns and runs the buses. This is important because at the current time, the total subsidy being made available to buses is being reduced, not increased. Perhaps more fundamentally, though, it's not clear how a significant share of current car traffic could in fact be transferred to buses. Considering the market for the three main passenger modes shown on this chart, around 85% of passenger kilometres are by car, van and taxi, 10% by rail and 5% by bus and coach. So a modal shift of 10% of car passenger kilometres to buses will result in a 170% increase in bus passenger kilometres. In general, the new bus passengers would have origins and destinations in less bus-friendly locations than current bus passengers. A very considerable increase in bus supply on a mixture of existing and new routes would be needed to increase the number of households with attractive services at both the beginning and at the end of trips, and without having to make too many interchanges. Evenings and weekends would need to be served much more intensively. Park and ride services could potentially play a role here, but bus park and ride needs to be approached very differently to the experience of the last 40 years, which has mainly seen park and rides operated as an additional set of bus routes, with a significant minority of those attractive being existing customers of bus and rail services. People who as a consequence use their cars more than before and public transport less, with each site generally requiring millions in construction grant and hundreds of thousands per annum in operating subsidy. Therefore, on balance, I believe bus services will continue to serve an important role and will show patronage growth in particular corridors and markets, but the conventional bus approach would be insufficient to make a significant impact on energy consumption and carbon emissions in the context of 6 decades of car-oriented spatial planning and socio-cultural change. The viability of existing bus services currently faces a number of risks, from inducing subsidy, the higher costs of low emissions technology, and potentially competition from electric cars, which will be expensive to purchase but cheap to run, creating captive car users of their owners and possibly creating worse operating conditions on the road for bus public transport. So turning to my last section, if we need a focus of emphasis to our transport strategy, and cleaner cars will only tackle some of the symptoms of the disease, and additional bus services can only provide a partial cure, where do we look for a fuller remedy? Transport studies is made up of a number of disciplines, and each contributes valuable lessons to the knowledge pool. Sociology emphasises that we and our travel are much more individualistic in our choices and patterns compared with the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Times when communities were largely defined spatially, with people in particular streets tending to attend the same schools, work in the same factories, visit the same shopping centres, and even holiday at the same time in the same resorts. Planning and geography confirm that our housing, retail and working spaces have become increasingly car-oriented over the last 6 decades, and our travel patterns more complex as a result. A major constraint here is that the built environment is only replaced at a rate of approximately 1% per year. Even if all our new development was less car dependent, and unfortunately some of it is not, then it would take decades to return to the hub and spoke urban forms that are benign to public transport. Economics explains human travel behaviour as significantly influenced by rational analysis of costs and benefits and relative price. On the other hand, psychology describes the important role that habit and self-presentation play within society, which may result in transport choices which appear to some observers to be rather irrational. And technologists are aware that decision-making is increasingly spontaneous, with information sought immediately prior to travel and updated on the move, with fellow travellers becoming an important source of social travel information alongside the more official, formal travel information. So the forms of transport needed to address both the new mobilities and its associated transport problems must accommodate travellers who make decisions often at the last minute or even whilst travelling. It must allow for users who expect their transport systems to respond to their choices and with a lower level of constraint than has typically been the case with public transport. The systems must be affordable, if not more affordable than current options, particularly rail and taxis. The system policy must consider the needs of both those with or without a car available as equally important and include them within the same system. Above all, it should provide a much superior emissions performance than the current transport system. The overall ethos can be described as collective mobility, enabling individuals to realise their personal plans in a highly unconstrained way whilst delivering the resource efficiencies that can only be achieved through travelling collectively. A number of the elements of this system are already emerging. Cycle sharing and car club schemes reduce the need for cycle and car ownership and maintenance by the individual traveller. By reducing the sunk costs of using those modes, they enable individuals to choose the most appropriate option for each journey. Bike sharing in particular can combine effectively with rail services, enabling the combination of the two to compete with long-distance private car use or indeed taxi use to reach the station. However, before there can be a widespread adoption of cycle sharing outside of the larger cities, new market models need to emerge that are less dependent on public subsidy. One of the few ways we could radically reduce congestion and emissions at very low cost to the state will be a very significant increase in car occupancy. Lift sharing and carpooling match up those willing to reduce their travel impacts. They also assist those without access to a car at all. However, there are modest convenience penalties alongside the financial savings that are available, so significant further uptake of these options may not occur unless car use costs rise sharply. Personal rapid transit is now being implemented as a technology, including at Heathrow Airport. PRT is largely in tune with the ethos of collective mobility in that it provides for individualised journeys through a publicly available mode. However, one difference here is the current presumption against the sharing of PRT vehicles. The main motivations for this restriction seem to be personal security and an intention to replicate the door-to-door features of the car. Our research in Bath into the feasibility of such a mode of transport suggests, however, that the sharing of PRT vehicles by passengers with the same journey requirements might well be acceptable, and indeed even desirable under the right conditions. And the health benefits of walking a reasonable distance to a stop are also recognised by the wider public. Nonetheless, PRT requires substantial capital investment and complete segregation from other transport modes. So applications in the near future, at least, I think will be very few. Most bus services are run along similar principles as to when they were introduced in the early 20th century, with fixed timetables and fixed routes. This makes serving diffuse or irregular demand financially expensive and environmentally costly. Shared taxis and taxi buses, though, are well established in particular niches around the world. Not all of the examples I'm showing here would be appropriate for the UK, certainly in terms of safety standards or passenger experience. But the developing countries in particular demonstrate some highly efficient use of resources in these mobility systems. And in the UK, Rural taxi buses such as the Devon Fair Car operate door-to-door with a flexible schedule and only run if requested. And shared taxis from airports increase the efficiency of taxi operations by grouping up travellers with similar destinations. But in order to provide a serious collective mobility option which challenges the car, shared taxis will need to operate with much shorter response times than current private hire taxi services. They will have to be delivered through having a large-scale operation and a very efficient vehicle location and scheduling system. There are some existing systems which partly achieve this specification. Taxi, for example, shown here, enables travellers to text for a taxi and then meet up and share the vehicle with travellers who are decided by the system to be going the same way. Fares for high-technology shared taxis are potentially significantly lower than taxi fares, as not only are the drivers' labour costs split between multiple passengers, but much of the empty running and the downtime, the waiting time associated with taxi operations could be eliminated. For the same reasons, energy consumption and emissions could potentially be much lower. Significant barriers exist to such a system emerging, however. Taxi operators have so far rarely seen passenger sharing as in their interests. They would need to operate as part of an integrated system rather as individual traders. There is also a major transition problem that the system would require a very large scale to provide an efficient, low-cost service, but convincing enough of the interest to begin the service at sufficient scale would be challenging. So as a big bang implementation seems unlikely, it will be necessary to build such a system from integrating existing initiatives. One such innovative and novel initiative is the GOLO integrated travel network being developed in the Bristol area. This involves the National Health Service, Bristol City Council, and hopefully eventually many other institutions. The scheme currently enables the participating organisations to share their car and electric bike pool fleets so they are more flexible and efficiently used. Employees could potentially use the fleets for private journeys, reducing the need for them to own their own cars. Carpooling and taxi sharing could be a logical extension of this approach. Similarly, for the wider public, the lift share approach could be combined with electronic hailing so that a request for a lift could be met almost immediately following a text message by a passing private car or a pool car or perhaps a shared taxi or a bus. Such changes may sound radical and incredible, but if we consider the case of Cuba, it is clear that major change can occur rapidly under specific circumstances. And I'm grateful here for the work of Marcus Enoch and in developing papers on this particular topic. In the 1990s, Cuba experienced a 70% decline in its oil imports due to the ending of its favourable trading relations with the Soviet Union. Some of the transport policies adopted as a result are very familiar to us. Support for a rapid increase in cycling. Cycling was virtually non-existent in Cuba prior to this crisis. And the enhancement of public transport. Although the conversion of tank transporters to buses, as occurred in Cuba, would probably, hopefully, be resisted by a first group in Bristol. Alongside a reversal in the move away from animal transport in rural areas, a more novel idea in the urban centres was to enable people to exchange jobs in order to be able to work nearer home. But some of the most interesting and effective developments were in fact in terms of collective mobility. A major expansion in the role of taxi buses, employer-provided buses, and organised lift sharing. Public sector vehicles were required by law to fill vacant seats, and local authority marshals placed on busy junctions to encourage others to take part in the national lift sharing scheme. A major shock to our system of mobility, such as occurred in Cuba, would no doubt have somewhat different effects. For example, one response which occurred in Cuba, a major shift back to walking as a transport mode, will be hard to replicate now in the UK due to our built environment constraints. This suggests an even greater reliance on collective mobility and cycling would be needed here. The other key lesson is that the Cuban situation had to be treated as an emergency, with strategies for localisation and decentralisation introduced to reduce the need for travel. Similar changes in the UK are likely to be highly disruptive and come at high resource and social cost, particularly if introduced on an emergency basis. To conclude, we have committed as a nation to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% on 2008 by 2050. An interim target of 34% reduction by 2020 is just 8 years away, but more than one independent evaluation suggests that existing policies are inadequate and insufficient to meet that target. The transport sector is responsible for around a quarter of UK carbon emissions and is the only sector not to have begun contributing in any significant way to carbon reduction. At the same time, we are likely to experience rising fossil fuel prices caused by world market factors beyond our control. Whether we choose to act or are forced to act, it is likely that a significant decarbonisation of the transport system will in fact occur in the next decade or so. The most high-profile policy solution at the moment is to substitute current car technologies. This approach is attractive to many because it appears to offer reduced energy consumption and emissions without requiring us to change travel behaviour much. And it is also the least threatening descent path for the automotive industries. However, major questions about affordability and deliverability remain. And for many, it would also be a lost opportunity if the owner-driver car fleet was simply replaced, particularly in the context of an ageing population, which means licence holding as a proportion of the adult population will soon peak. Traditionally, the key alternative to a private car-oriented system in the UK has been seen as bus-oriented. Most households live near a bus stop, more so than live near a rail station. Many of the distances currently travelled are beyond acceptable walking and cycling range for a lot of people. However, providing sufficient public transport capacity using fixed bus routes and schedules will simply be too expensive and inefficient to meet the complex nature of the trips now made, due to the nature of the built environment and also our social expectations about mobility. There is some prospect for public transport-oriented spatial planning to increase the viability of public transport in the future, but this is not going to be speedy enough for the highly car-dependent suburban locations and the smaller settlements. We need to move more quickly. Instead, we must look to collective mobility solutions, the sharing of transport assets, taking full advantage of high technology to optimise efficiency and manage through well-performing institutions. International examples, such as the case of Cuba, show us that if a crisis comes, we can and will change our mobility patterns. But although rapid change may be possible, it may come too late to meet climate change objectives and may entail significant socioeconomic shock. So the real challenge for strategic transport policy in the next decades is not whether we can achieve travel behaviour change, it's whether we can persuade society that it's more comfortable to change our mobility patterns sooner rather than later. We would do well to accelerate our planning for change and begin our behavioural adjustments now. Thank you very much for your attention.